My name is Al, and I am a geologist. And it has been quite some time since I last made a video. I do apologize for that. There were protests against police brutality. You probably heard about them. There were even some protests in the city I was living in, so I didn't really feel like it was the time for me to be making my silly little videos about cartoons and science. So I decided to take a break. And then when I started to feel a bit more comfortable with making my silly little videos again, I moved. So I didn't really have the time to make any videos. But I moved, I'm settled in for the most part. My dog is just off screen, licking herself, and I'm very excited to be making another video, finally. And I'm gonna get right out in front of something, just take care of something right off the bat. Yes, I'm wearing glasses. I actually have really bad eyesight. I just normally wear contacts, but I ran out of contacts and I won't get any new ones until my next eye appointment. So I am stuck wearing my glasses for a little while, and you get to watch the light from the window reflect off of the lenses every now and then. So, win-win, I guess. In the previous videos I've done on this channel, I've reacted to a single episode of a cartoon. I watch an episode and look for any sort of moments where I could talk about science, particularly geology or biology. But today I'm going to be doing something different. Instead of reacting to a single episode of a cartoon, I'm going to be dissecting one aspect of a cartoon series as a whole. The cartoon is Avatar: The Last Airbender, and the aspect is earthbending. But you probably figured that out from the title of this video. For those of you who don't know, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a cartoon that aired from 2005 to 2008. It's been experiencing a bit of a revival this year because Netflix gained the rights to stream it on their website, as well as the sequel series Legend of Korra. The whole premise behind Avatar: The Last Airbender is that there are people who have the ability to telekinetically manipulate one of the four classical elements: water, earth, fire, and air. I just said the elements in the order that Katara does in the intro.
Water. Earth. Fire. Air.
Anyways, the people who are able to telekinetically manipulate one of these elements are called benders. And the element that they are able to manipulate is sort of tacked onto the beginning of the word. So someone who can manipulate air would be called an airbender. Someone who can manipulate fire would be called a firebender. Someone who can manipulate water is a waterbender. And finally, someone who can manipulate earth is called an earthbender. As I was rewatching the show, which I was rewatching it because it was on Netflix, I started thinking about earthbenders. But not just about earthbenders, about earth in particular. You see, 3 of the 4 classical elements have pretty obvious definitions. Air would be just gases, mostly a mixture of gases. Fire is a chemical reaction, and water is good old H2O, dihydrogen monoxide. But what is Earth? Earth is something that has different definitions depending upon the context. You could be using it to refer to the planet. You could be using it to refer to dirt. So how exactly is Earth defined within the context of Avatar: The Last Airbender? Today I'm going to be trying to come up with a definition for Earth within the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm going to be using the show, not any of the comics. I'm also not going to be using anything from the sequel series Legend of Korra. I would like to make a sort of sequel video where I talk about the earthbending scene in Legend of Korra, but that's not today. And I'm also not going to be using anything from the Kyoshi books. I'm just going to be talking about the earthbending that we see in Avatar: The Last Airbender. The very first earthbending that we see on Avatar: The Last Airbender is actually in the intro to the show, when Katara narrates the whole story of the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. When she says the different elements, when she says Earth, we see a sort of shadowy figure sort of make this giant rock come up out of the ground, and then he kicks it away. So right off the bat, we know that the definition of Earth within Avatar: The Last Airbender has to include rocks. And that raises the question of, what are rocks, other than the little props that I have sitting right next to me? Well, that's not much easier to answer than what is Earth. There is absolutely a dictionary definition for rock, but I never memorized any sort of scientific geologic definition that I had to write down on an exam for a grade. And I'm pretty sure the reason why I never had to learn a specific scientific definition is because it would be really difficult to come up with one. Yes, like I said, there's a dictionary definition, absolutely, but scientific definitions are held to higher standards than dictionary definitions. Scientists describe the world as a whole. So when we are describing things, when we define things, we can't allow for a lot of wiggle room, we can't allow for a lot of exceptions, because we are describing the natural world. We are sort of stamping down saying, this is what this thing is. There is no room for exceptions. You'd actually be surprised by how difficult it is to come up with a scientific definition for a basic core concept in science. The next time you see a biologist, ask them what a species is. I say this because there is no real scientific definition for species. In biology, there are actually multiple rough draft versions of what a species is, because it is near impossible to, currently it is impossible to come up with a definition that is universal for all species. Rocks, I feel, are the geology world version of a species, and not just because sometimes we refer to rocks as species. I can only think of one trait that all rocks share. They're naturally occurring. If you see a chunk of concrete or asphalt or something, that's man-made. That is not a rock. But I can't think of anything else. I'm not joking. I literally cannot think of another trait that is shared amongst all rocks. Even the very first thing that you probably thought of when I started talking about this, that rocks are made up of minerals, isn't universal. Off the top of my head, I can think of 2 rocks that are not made up of minerals. Coal, which is basically plant matter that had dreams of becoming a rock star and ended up becoming a rock, and obsidian, which is glass created by a volcano. Neither of those are made of minerals, but they're both considered to be rocks. So you can't say that all rocks are made up of minerals. We actually see earthbenders manipulating coal in one of the episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Specifically, they manipulate coal in the episode that this fantastic scene is from.
That lemur! He's earthbending!
No, you idiot! It's the girl!
Oh, of course.
I love that scene. So because we see earthbenders able to manipulate coal on Avatar: The Last Airbender, then we know that rocks are included in the definition of Earth. But as we find out when we see some specialized bending techniques in the second season, earthbending doesn't just include rocks, it also includes minerals. Unlike rocks, minerals have a very specific scientific definition, one that I did have to memorize and write down on an exam for a grade. A mineral is a naturally occurring, inorganic, crystalline solid with a definite but not necessarily fixed chemical composition. To translate, minerals have to be able to be found in nature. They cannot be made by an organism. They have to be solid. Their atoms have to be arranged in a specific organization that we refer to as a crystallized structure, and they have to have a chemical composition that we can use to essentially identify the mineral. So there are a lot of things that meet most of the qualifications to be a mineral, but they miss out on one of them, and as such they are not considered a mineral. A lot of times we refer to them as mineraloids to sort of recognize the fact that, hey, they're almost minerals, but they're not quite. In the second season, in the episodes The Library and The Desert, we see a new subfield of earthbending called sandbending. As the name suggests, they're able to telekinetically manipulate sand. Sand is not a rock. Technically speaking, it's a grain size, but it's often used in shorthand to refer to sediment that is very rich in sand-sized grains. For reasons I won't get into right now, the vast majority of sand-sized grains are made up of the mineral quartz. You can get sand-sized grains of other minerals like feldspar, and you can get rock fragments that have been broken down to a sand size, but the vast majority of the time, sand-sized grains are going to be made up of quartz, particularly at the two locations where we see sand bending occur in the show, a desert and a beach. So the fact that we are able to see earthbenders manipulate loose sand that is going to be primarily made up of the mineral quartz proves that earthbenders are able to manipulate minerals in addition to being able to manipulate rocks. For me, at least, that's how I think Earth is defined within the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's defined as rocks and minerals, because we see earthbenders manipulating rocks and minerals. I actually have a little bit more that I want to talk to with regards to earthbending that we see in Avatar: The Last Airbender. And both of the things I want to talk about, too, were sort of pioneered by none other than the legendary blind bandit herself, Toph Beifong, who happens to be my favorite character. As the moniker The Blind Bandit suggests, Toph Beifong was born blind. She actually uses her earthbending to see around her, in a method similar to how bats use echolocation or boats use sonar to construct what is going on underneath the surface of a body of water. Toph uses her earthbending to sense vibrations in the ground and then uses that information to construct a mental image of what is around her. She's basically a legend. I told you she was just out of frame. This ability of Toph's to sense vibrations in the earth and be able to see things without actually seeing is referred to as seismic sensing. I don't know if it's said on the show, but it is the term that the Avatar Wiki uses, so that's the term that I'm going to use. I bring up seismic sensing because it's actually very similar to a technique that is used in geology. Sadly, the modern-day geological technique that is similar to Toph's seismic sense does not involve earthbending at all. It involves sending out a seismic wave into the earth and then tracking how the wave behaves, seeing whether it bounces off of things, what it bounces off of, tracking its speed, that just sort of general, how does it act? We have specialized instruments that are able to track this behavior, and then we are able to use that data to construct a image or just in general get information about what's below our feet. This technique is referred to as reflection seismology because you're using seismic waves and you're seeing when they reflect off of things, essentially. The data that we've collected from tracking the behavior of seismic waves in the Earth's interior actually is the primary piece of evidence we have to support the theory that the Earth's outer core is liquid while the inner core is solid. I always thought that was pretty cool, that Toph's seismic sense is similar to techniques that we use in geology now. Now, there's one last aspect of earthbending that I want to talk about and view from a geological perspective, and that would be metal bending. Technically speaking, it should probably belong with, my discussion of how is Earth defined, but Toph invented metal bending using her seismic sense, so I wanted to explain her seismic sense first. In the second season, Toph invents metal bending. Essentially what happens is she's locked in a metal box, and she uses her seismic sense and detects impurities within the metal, impurities that she is actually able to manipulate. So she manipulates those impurities, bends the metal, and is back on her way to Ba Sing Se. Now, I'm pretty sure that the impurities that Toph detects are supposed to be like little grains of sediment or little bits of rock. But they don't explicitly say that in the show, at least not to the best of my recollection, which means that there is room for interpretation. And because I have been given the room to interpret, I will interpret. I think perhaps, those impurities are still metal. But metal minerals. Earlier, I rattled off the definition of a mineral. It's a naturally occurring inorganic crystalline solid with a definite but not necessarily fixed chemical composition. Fun fact, a lot of elements, particularly metal elements, meet that definition. Or at least they meet most of the definition. The sticking point tends to be the crystalline part. A lot of metals are going to be present primarily in an amorphous form, meaning that the atoms aren't arranged in any particular way, shape, or form. And in order for something to be considered a mineral, the atoms have to be arranged in a very specific organized pattern called a crystalline structure, like I mentioned before. It's not the most common thing in the world, but you can get occasional naturally occurring outcrops of crystalline metal elements. You can also get crystalline non-metal elements like sulfur. Sulfur is pretty notorious for appearing in a crystalline form and thus being considered a mineral. But there are metals that can do this as well. Gold, silver, copper, tin. Bismuth is very famous for appearing in a crystalline structure. Like I said, it's not super common, but it happens often enough that we actually have a specific name for these instances of elements appearing in a crystalline form. Native elements. So here's where my room for interpretation comes into play. Maybe, the impurities that Toph senses in the metal are not sediment, they are not rock. Maybe they are grains of metal that is in a crystalline structure and thus is a mineral, and thus she can manipulate. There's absolutely no way that my little conspiracy theory is true. I just wanted to share with you and talk about the fact that metals can sometimes be minerals, especially because, fun fact, a few months ago, a cousin of mine tried to argue with me about it. It's like, you might be studying to become a doctor and, like, save lives and stuff, but I have a degree in rocks, so I'm the expert here. Like I said at the beginning, I would love to make a sequel video where I talk about the earthbending that we see in Legend of Korra. So if you'd like to see that video, or if you had just enjoyed this new format where I dissected things instead of reacted to things, leave a like and a comment. And if you'd like to see more content of a geologist who has a master's degree in geoscience, just talk about children's cartoons, go ahead and subscribe. That's about it for today. I hope that you have a nice day.